How do we view the effect of beer? Come on now. Holy.
We are so dependent on it. If you have a social gathering and there isn't booze there, people lose their minds. Celebrating. Let's go to the pub when we talk about commiserating. Let's go to the pub. I'm happy. Let's go to the pub. My dog died. Let's go to the pub.
It's Wednesday, best day of the week.
Great job getting us drunk.
We could all use a stiff drink. Fantastic. Margarita day.
If you're not going to drink it, pass it around.
How are you guys spending New Year's Eve?
I'm going to get real drunk.
Many years ago, we did a poll in Parliament and we asked them, is alcohol a drug? And the majority of politicians said alcohol is not a drug. And they say, well, it's not a drug because it's not illegal. And that gets to this peculiar, dangerous concept that once something's illegal, it must be dangerous. And when something's not illegal, it must be safe.
So it's interesting, if we look at the whole issue of illegal drugs in our society, you will find that when the word drug is used to refer to those substances, another word is almost always attached to it, and that is abuse. Drug abuse.
What happens is that all illicit drugs get lumped together. Caffeine is a drug. Alcohol is a drug.
Tylenol is a drug. Sudafed is a drug.
Viagra is a drug. People, when they think of drugs, they think only of illicit drugs.
There's a mass of disinformation, and that misinformation and disinformation confuses the shit out of people when they're trying to form their version of what's good and what's bad in the world.
If it's absurd to throw somebody in prison for drinking coffee or for drinking wine, then it's equally absurd and wrong to throw somebody in prison for smoking cannabis.
Nobody has ever overdosed on cannabis. Did you know that?
So what? They can't perform daily functions. They're going to be on my tax bill.
The idea that one is okay and one isn't just seemed to require something resembling evidence before you could make that statement definitively.
One of the things that I think is important about marijuana use or alcohol use or anything is that you're responsible with it. And you could be irresponsible with anything. You should weigh the risks and the rewards.
There's no moral middle ground. Indifference is not an option. We want you to help us create an outspoken intolerance for drug use.
Is the rationale of protecting people from themselves valid?
The only people who are responsible for protecting us from ourselves are ourselves. If our society denies us the opportunity to make mistakes, it's denying us a very fundamental human right, because mistakes are part of the teaching process in this life.
Tell another grown human being, oh, not allowed that. A grown man. No, not you. But I'm a grown-up. I'm an evolved human being. No, just put that down.
If there's a real harm in a drug, and your real objective is to persuade people that they shouldn't harm themselves in that way, you don't need laws that send them to prison. What you need is good information that they'll believe. Just disseminate that information, and free, independent, sovereign adults will make their own choices about that information, either to continue with that drug or not to continue with it, but they have the facts.
If a professional like you cannot answer clearly that meth is more dangerous than marijuana, which every kid on the street knows, which every parent knows, if you can't answer that, maybe that's why we're failing to educate people about the dangers. I don't want kids smoking marijuana. I agree with the chairman. But if the deputy director of the Office of Drug Policy can't answer that question, how do you expect high school kids to take you seriously?
I empathize with parents of teenage kids. They can get lost. Kids sitting in school stoned. You can't accept a position that says, oh, that's fine, no problem. Yeah, it's a problem. But the question is whether it's a criminal problem. The question is whether it's a growing up kind of a problem. I want reasons more than you need to be afraid of some cop catching you and locking you up forever in a prison to talk to my children about how they relate to various temptations in life.
This country is held up as a model around the world of dealing with cigarette smoking. We brought it down, way down. Why? By educating people.
It doesn't make sense to punish people if what you're mainly worried about is their welfare.
Name something that gets passed around. Chris.
A joint.
A joint? The moral question of drug use you can set aside because the drug use and the drug abuse is here.
We have a real fundamental enjoyment of changing the way that this thing operates. And for as long as that is true, you have demand. You don't have to be a capitalist, you don't have to be an economist, but we all know where there is demand, there is supply.
A plant that's very easy to grow suddenly becomes something that's worth thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars a pound because you're compensating the producers and the transporters for the risk of going to jail or being arrested or being shot or other things that happen to people involved in criminal activity.
And with that profit comes opportunity, sometimes to the most unlikely of people.
I went to Oxford to study nuclear physics and did some postgraduate in history and philosophy of science, but forsook the halls of academia to become a dope smuggler. Quite early on, I started smuggling cannabis from Europe to America. In those days, in the very early 70s, there'd be a markup of about 300%. British bands were beginning to get very popular, and they were visiting the States with an awful lot of equipment. So we used to hide the hashish in various speakers and amplifiers, etc. Pink Floyd, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Eric Clapton, Genesis. The bands didn't know that it was just an arrangement I made with the road managers. Organizations I was involved with the mafia, the Yakuza, the IRA, and a few cowboys from the CIA. But it wasn't under CIA auspices, it was just a few cowboys who were doing things behind the rest of the CIA's back. Consignments I did into JFK in New York with the Gambino family. The deal was structured in such a way that one couldn't cheat them, even if one was daft enough to try. The average load would be about a ton. I had a huge number of aliases during my smuggling career, at least 43 aliases. But it was so much easier in those days to get a false passport. I remember on one occasion applying to the driving license center for a license in the name of Elvis Presley, of whom I'm a big fan, okay? And they actually issued it because computers didn't scream in the 50s, right? So, Elvis Presley, fine. The biggest shipment ever that I did was 30 tons. The DEA say it was 50 tons, but I know it was only 30 tons. The British had more or less given up, and now you can't catch him. Spanish had given up, now you can't catch him. Americans said, oh, we'll catch him. And they were right. So it was a combined effort of 14 different countries' law enforcement, spearheaded by the DEA, actually. Cannabis was the only drug I smuggled. I think largely because I wasn't really tempted to do anything else. The demand for cannabis wasn't met. If cannabis had been legal, I would have carried on being an academic in some sort. I do miss smuggling, you can never get that thrill, that I had from crossing borders, or from writing. You can't. And I suppose if I thought I could get away with it, I'd crank it up today. I'd go back and do it. I loved it.
It's interesting when you look at the amount of money that these drugs are generating. Where does that money go? And who's handling it?
With the vast amounts of money to be made, the potential for a dark side of the underground market begins to grow. With enough time and enough money, it can rise to inconceivable levels, and often right under our nose.
What the drug war has done to Mexico is horrific. The death toll alone in the Mexican drug war under the Calderon administration, it's more than the number of Americans that were lost in Vietnam.
Now we're up to 70,000 dead. 70,000!
The bloodshed follows a mass killing in the Mexican border city of Nuevo Laredo last week, where 9 bodies were left for the public to see, and 14 other bodies were found mutilated.
And this is happening on our southern border, and yet very little attention is paid to it.
It is the United States that sends the guns across the borders to Mexico. It's the United States that then, in return for the guns, imports the drugs.
A lot of people think that those 70,000 dead are all gangsters shooting it out with each other. Not true. They're police officers, their children, their families, their mothers and fathers.
You're raising your kids with an education, and your kids go off to a nightclub some night and they never come home. Why? Because kids have been kidnapped at random and mutilated.
Beyond the horrific death toll and the horrific acts of violence and decapitations and bodies hanging from bridges, the drug wars really led to a deterioration in the infrastructures of society, which means that virtually every municipal police force in much of Mexico is corrupted by one cartel or another. What does that mean? That means if you're a lower middle class Mexican, your house gets broken into, who do you call? Right? You have nobody to go to. And if you do call the police, well, they're just as likely to tell the cartel, hey, this person's ratting on you, as they are to come and help you and take a report and bring somebody to jail. So if you murder somebody in Mexico, you have less than a 5% chance of ever spending a day in jail for that. And that is almost entirely a product of what the drug war has done to law enforcement, the judiciary, and the correction systems in Mexico. The last thing a Mexican drug trafficking cartel would want would be for drugs to be legalized in the United States, because that would take away their primary source of income.
How do you kill a cartel and the street gang organization in drugs? You take their source of nutrition away. Their source of nutrition is money, drug money. You dry them up.
The idea that you're going to be able to somehow or another make marijuana illegal and it's not going to have some impact on organized crime is so fucking dumb. It's childish.
This prohibition allows them to flourish. I mean, it did with alcohol.
When prohibition was going on and the mafia and Al Capone and all them motherfuckers was in control, they ran that shit.
The American people soon came to understand that prohibition of alcohol brought greater harm than the abuse of alcohol.
The current prohibition on the marijuana laws makes everything more dangerous.
$370 billion a year go into underworld's pockets, and bad people with that kind of money can do horrendous things.
If marijuana prohibition isn't achieving the goals we think it should, what has caused it to be pursued the way it has? What are the elements that keep it propped up? And where did it all start? While most fingers might point to the year 1937 when marijuana was first outlawed by a tax snap required for hemp, let's fast forward 34 years to 1971. That was the year the public first heard this.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to summarize for you the meeting that I have just had with bipartisan leaders. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
Attorney General Kleindienst for Nixon was quoted thereafter, and he was sorrowful that he had been involved in this. He said that they knew in the Nixon administration that drug treatment works and incarceration does not, but the enormous political benefit by declaring a war on drugs that can't really fight back. He said they chose the incarceration route for political reasons and then were absolutely overwhelmed at the positive political benefits that they received for doing that.
There's actual documentation that shows the United States government under Nixon was actively writing to universities and saying, pull your information of cannabis and hemp and marijuana out of your libraries. Literally, purge it.